Flanders Fields by John McCrae. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses row on row that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, President Kay, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Rotarians. We often have interesting meetings. I always find this one and some dealing with the youth exchange, some of our most special meetings of the year. Today we're very fortunate to have an outstanding representative of our military in attendance. And he just asked me to take it easy. He's fairly humble, but I do have to tell you some of his credentials and a little background. Commodore John Newton graduated from Dalhousie University in 1981 with a Bachelor of Science. After a short career as a geologist, he enrolled in the Canadian Forces in 1983. As a junior naval officer, he acquired specialist skills in navigation, communications, and operations. He completed tours on the destroyer Iroquois, the replenishment ship Preserver, and the frigate Montreal. Later, during the Cold War, he was deployed on NATO missions and was in various United Nations peace support operations, including the Gulf War in 1991, Haiti in 1993, and the maritime embargo of a former Yugoslavia in 1995. He has developed specialty skills in Canadian maritime sovereignty, which will be very important to Canada in the years ahead. He gained this skill through countless fishery patrols and 3 Arctic sovereignty missions. He also commanded the patrol ships HMCS Anticosti and the frigate HMCS Fredericton from 2003 to 2006. During this time, he experienced his lifelong dream of patrolling the fabled Northwest Passage. In 2000, He completed a year of joint military studies at the Command and Staff College in Toronto, followed by taking advanced military studies in 2004. He has held staff appointments in Naval Operations Schools, Maritime Force Atlantic Headquarters, and Maritime Command Headquarters. Following his promotion to captain in 2006, he served at the National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa as Director of International Plans in the Strategic Joint Staff, charged with the files that included the commitment of the Canadian Force in Afghanistan, Sudan, amongst others. In 2008, he assumed command of Canadian Forces Base Halifax, one of Canada's largest forces bases throughout the country, and he led the planning efforts to celebrate the Navy's centennial, including organizing Her Majesty's participation in the International Fleet Review. Commodore Newton was promoted to his present rank in August 2010 and appointed Director General Naval Personnel. Fellow Rotarians and guests, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you one of Canada's top military leaders, Commodore John Newton.
Well, good day, everybody. How are you? You got to know that my nickname in the Navy is ADD. Because I can't stand still, and every time I get up to speak, whatever I've prepared to talk about is not what comes out. So be aware. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my biography so it never gets read again. I'm going to change it to something more reads like this. He's the father of 6 children, loves his career in the Canadian Forces, and wouldn't trade any other career for it, even that career in geology. And that's about as short as it should be. I'm no different than any of you people, a proud Canadian, a humble kid from Halifax, Nova Scotia, with a father from Oil Springs, Ontario, and we joined the Merchant Marine right here in Sarnia. So, microphones, eh? How does it work without the microphone? Well, first off, Kay, Curtis, President, all the past presidents, thank you for the invitation today. Usually I prepare my speech when I'm sitting at the table and I'm getting the feel of the people around me and feeling the vibration of the room and what you all stand for. So I can tell you right off the bat, Walter, you took the first part of my brief away from me by getting all the people who were associated with the military and the security of Canada to stand up. And there was a lot of people here who stayed sitting because they didn't think hard enough. In the military, we don't think that many families of Canada, the old Canada, from wartime Canada, have anybody. Everybody has somebody associated with the military, put differently. Almost every family here has a relative who served in some place or another. To my fellow Canadian Forces members, commanders of the units, to the reservists, the regular force members that are here. I understand one of them is in my own staff. You learn things every day. You learn that I do not have the gene for facial recognition. All right, I have a story to tell. When you do a little bit of public speaking, you should always speak with passion and from the heart, and never go out of your lane and speak about things you don't know of. But I'm going to go out of my lane and talk about the Great War and the World War I. Not about the violence and the conflict really, but just a little story that came to me a few years ago. I'm not a historian of the Great War. My grandfather fought in it, survived it, and went on to a happy long life, hiding all the secrets of what he knew. But recently, when I was the base commander in Halifax, I sent my people out in the fall with the United Way effort to work in the community. Very similar values we have in the military as do the Rotarians. Service before self, service to community, helping others, brotherhood of man, humanity. We stand for all that. And that's why the Canadian Forces do so good when they serve overseas. Okay. So I sent a team around to Halifax, around to paint a house, to fix the roof of a house. And one of the places the United Way directed us to was to a little mobile home in a trailer park in Beaverbank, Nova Scotia, a little bit of a poor area on the outskirts of the town. And there lived a woman in her 80s with a daughter my age, with a granddaughter the age of my daughter, one of my daughters, and they were all living on welfare. The mobile home was a bit of a wreck. Winter was coming on, and the daughter was handicapped, to say the least, and you could imagine their circumstances were pretty sad. And we don't often wander around in the poorest neighborhoods of the cities, but we should do a lot more of it. And I went to visit that one crew that was working in the trailer park, and I met the old lady, and she invited me in and gave me tea and sat her down in her humble surroundings, and I hadn't quite seen anything like this for a long time, what those surroundings were like, as my men fixed the ramp for the wheelchair, fixed the door so the wind wouldn't blow in and the rain stopped raining into the kitchen of the mobile home. And not knowing really where to start the conversation with her, I asked her, do you know anybody who's ever served in the Canadian Armed Forces? And she put her hand inside her blouse and she pulled out a little silver chain with a cross on it. And she goes, well, I do. And I'd never seen a memorial cross at that time. That was the first time in my career, 3 years ago, I saw the memorial cross worn by only a few people today. A lot of mothers and spouses or partners of people killed in Afghanistan would be the most recent recipients. You see Canadians wearing the memorial crosses all across Canada at Remembrance Day. And I'll show you one here in a moment. And so when she told me that this is the memorial cross of somebody in her family, generations back, and it had been passed down to her, and she was the last surviving woman in the family, and she was wearing it. Have the next slide. Can I do from here? I'm not qualified. Where's my handy technician? I know how to do this. All right. So I'm going to tell you a small story. Because the memorial cross, when you flipped it over, had the name William Harcourt Smith engraved on the back of it. 8 October 1916. I'm not the historian of the Great War, but if you're wearing a memorial cross and it's got your name on it, or a person's name on it, that person died in the conflict. He died in combat. And he died about a year after enlisting. And there's his enlistment papers from downtown Toronto. And if you could read that from where you're at, it's a pretty simple thing. One sheet of paper, 2 sides to it. You went into the military depot. You went in with somebody that could attest to say that you were who you were, a parent or a spouse. It asks you about 10 or 15 questions at the top. But basically it's, have you ever served in the reserves? Are you fit? Are you who you say you are? Are you of the age that you're attesting? Where you live? And do you agree to be subject to the orders of Her Majesty as a member of the Canadian Armed Forces and the Canadian Expeditionary Force? And if you say yes to all that, the bottom 3 paragraphs, the big blocks of paragraphs, one is to say that you've answered the questions truthfully. 2 is to swear that in front of a magistrate of some sort or a serving officer of the Canadian Forces. And there you have it. If you flip it over, you're well on your way to being a Canadian Forces member of 1915. Describes you. It's a pretty simple description. He was 5'4", 35-inch chest, brown hair, brown eyes, a scar on his right hand, right finger. And a certificate of health by the doctor attending to say you didn't have something like tuberculosis. And when that young man, 20 years old, William Harcourt Smith, signed the bottom of that document, that piece of paper, he just signed his death warrant. 1 year later, he would be dead. And there he is. If you read that, it says, Private William Harcourt Smith, whose home is at 612 Crawford Street, is today reported missing. He had not been many weeks at the front. Private Smith enlisted with the 95th Battalion last fall, and after spending the winter at exhibition camp, went overseas in May. Some weeks ago, he was drafted to the front. There's a photo, and that's in November 1916. So that's about a couple days after he's reported missing at the front. And a whole year later, he's finally reported dead, or presumed dead in the bottom caption, and then reported dead. And you can imagine the anguish of his young wife who had signed the attestation papers with him, or their one child. And that's all you got in 1916 and 1917. There was so much of that going on in Canada, all across the country, that the military officials could barely keep up with it all, public officials could barely keep up, and they didn't have the tools that we have today, the organizational might or any of it, to deal with the depth of and the burden of sorrow and grief that the nation was finding itself in as the war progressed. So I want to tell you, it's a pretty anonymous guy. I met him because I met his relative who was wearing the Silver Cross against her chest all these years, and somebody in their family had worn it all those years since 1916. So I felt it my duty now to become more informed of the Great War, a little bit more about it. I took on the task of learning about the Great War by just trying to study who William Harcourt Smith was. It touched me a little bit, to say the least. And he died in a place called the Somme in October, the third battle of the Somme. And that's that little blue bulge down the bottom of the slide. The only reason I put a map up is most people don't even know where the Somme is, or Passchendaele, or Ypres, or Verdun, or Vimy. It's right near the English Channel. It's not far inland. If you're going to have a war and a battle, you wouldn't have it there today. There's nothing there. There's actually nothing there. There's nothing of strategic importance at the Somme. You were going to have a war and a battle, you would fight over something. And what the Somme was an exercise to take the pressure off the French who were in a death struggle at Verdun. It was to stop troops from moving to the front at Verdun so that the two belligerents could have a fair deal, a fair battle. And General Haig initiated the battle at the Somme for the British, and in the reserve battalions were many Canadians of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Does it make any difference to any of us who actually look at the battle lines? It is just another little bump on a long front of a couple hundred miles in Belgium and France. And black and white photos don't do it justice either. But if you got any idea, it looked like the poppy fields at the beginning of my slideshow. The battlefields of the Great War were not pleasant. This road, this valley, that's what you call a valley in 1916 in the Somme, was called the Sausage Valley. And you can imagine why the troops, with their macabre sense of humor, called it the Sausage Valley. That's where the men and supplies moved to the front. And at the front, they were ground down. There's what it looked like from the air. It's not a pleasant place for a human being. Here's what the men looked like of the Canadian forces. Dirty, tired, beaten, back and forth to the front to fight and to be relieved, to come back to the front. There they are dressing their wounded in the middle of a battle. The men who were wounded were lucky. They went home. There's the battle plan. I don't think it means anything to any of us to study it in detail, of what they were trying to do, but the green and yellow and purple and red lines were the battalion and all their companies in wave after wave trying to take a place romantically called the Regina Trench, what had defied the Allies about 3 months of battle to try to take it. And there is the battle log of the unit. And I wouldn't mind just reading you something, because it's the most unbelievable reading you'll ever read. It's pretty hard to speak nowadays without talking in metaphor, where everything in our very colorful language is adequately described with lots of prose, lots of adjectives. And when you read these battle logs written the day of or the day after an event, you can find no metaphor. You can find no color. It's just straight matter of the fact. So just give me a moment to find it. It won't take long. So the battle log goes on of how the men were massed at the front. And at the top of this page of the battle log it says, "Meanwhile, bombs were brought forward to the A trench and by the supporting company, and the 2nd Battalion deposited in A trench, ready to be brought forward when needed. Owing to pressures being brought on the 16th Battalion on the left and the 4th Battalion on our right, we were obliged to pass the bombs to both these battalions. The first 2 hours after taking our objectives was fairly quiet. The enemy then started heavy shelling and bombing attacks, and by 11 a.m., all the officers of B and C companies had either been killed or wounded, and most of A and D company officers were casualties. The enemy were seen massing large bodies of troops in the valley in front of our position and started to heavily bomb over our block. And by this time, 12 noon, our supply of bombs and small arms and ammunition was running short. The men made a heroic stand in their second objective, but were forced to fall back to their first objective about 1:30 p.m. And by this time, only Major Haddon and Lieutenant Chatterton were left of the 14 officers who went into the assault. These officers did wonderful work in the reorganization of their men in this trench, but the enemy were far outnumbering our men, and being fresh troops and well supplied with bombs and small arms ammunition, were able to press on. About 2 p.m., Lieutenant Corporal Durbin of the stretcher bearer section, who had up to this time been bravely dressing wounded in the open, volunteered to carry the SOS message back to the battalion headquarters. He carried the message through heavy fire and delivered it at about 2:45 p.m. and then fell exhausted. Meanwhile, a stubborn stand was being made in the trenches. Our supply of bombs exhausted. Some of the men were forced out of their trench and fell back into shell holes, with some men of the battalion on our right. Lieutenant Chatterton rallied these men and started to bayonet charge, but was severely wounded through the shoulder. Some of this party reached their trenches again, and Lieutenant Chatterton, who in the meantime had his wound dressed, got up and carried on. It was now getting to about 3 p.m. and things were getting rather desperate. Our bombs and ammunition were completely exhausted. All the Lewis guns but one had been destroyed, and this one was up without ammunition. A retirement was inevitable. The men were fighting with their fists. Lieutenant Chatterton was killed by a sniper while trying to hold the enemy back. Corporal Walsh of A Company, realizing they were being forced back, managed to collect a few bombs from the wounded and killed and tried to make a stand, but was killed. A few minutes later, the remnants of the battalion were forced back to their starting place in the battle. And there is the last moments of Corporal William Harcourt Smith's life, explained in a little log on paper kept in the records of the Archives of Canada. And that's all you get on that man. He is so anonymous. He's never mentioned in the text. He's never mentioned on the internet anywhere except on the Archives of Canada, where his name is remembered in the Book of Remembrance at Parliament Hill. He's remembered somewhere. Somebody here talked of Vimy Ridge. William Harcourt Smith disappeared that night, and his body was never found. He was probably buried in the battlefield by the enemy members. And he's one of 11,000 names inscribed on Vimy Ridge, on the monument, which is Canadian property, the sovereign territory of Canada in France. If you ever go to France, I'm telling you, you must go there. You must go see Vimy Ridge. It is our nation explained to us. There's 11,000 Canadian names on it of men who have no known grave. W.H. Smith is engraved on it, and there lies his memory. Like many other men, all Canadians. There's the card in remembrance to him. But I'm not telling this pretty heavy story with any kind of malice or intent to deepen the feelings of grief over a conflict. Conflict is something that the country must very carefully judge whether to engage the Canadian forces in. And it's the lessons of the Somme, the bloodiest battle of World War I. It's the lessons of World War II and the Korean War. It's the lessons of Afghanistan, which forces our public leaders to very consciously decide when to use the Canadian forces in conflict. And if you've ever been to Parliament Hill, and it's another place everybody in this country should visit, you will see engraved all over that building the grief and sorrow of a nation. That building was built after the Great Fire destroyed the first one in 1919. And in that building, you will find monuments to the grief of a nation 1 year after the end of the Great War. There in the West Wing, looking out up the Ottawa River, is a monument to Vimy Ridge on the 9th of April, 1917, considered a victory for Canada. We don't celebrate it as a victory, we celebrate it as the sacrifice of war. The bowed head of the bighorn sheep. There's one of the books of remembrance, and William Harcourt Smith is remembered in the book of remembrance of the Great War. There's 7 books of remembrance, and he is remembered on the top right-hand column. There on the Peace Tower, you can see that statue of the soldier, the Great War soldier of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. There's 4 of them standing vigil over the memorial chamber, which is inside the Peace Tower. And there's a chapel, a Gothic chapel inside that tower. You must go there. It is for your soul that you should visit to see the sacrifice of our nation over the last 100 years. And then a big carving, there's a memorial cross hanging at the entrance to the memorial chamber. Much, much larger than life, to remember the grief of all the broken families in Canada. And there's a veteran's spouse with a young veteran's spouse at a recent ceremony in Ottawa. And there they are wearing their memorial crosses. And there's one of the books I'm going to talk about in a minute. But just to finish up, the remembering is important to a nation. Everyone here has their own reason to remember. Stan Hill's brother and his uncle. Do I got it right, Stan? I told you I would remember your name. You were going to give it to me. I wouldn't remember yours. Died in conflict. But just imagine, and it's not hard to imagine in all our personal family stories, all the broken families that are out there. And when a nation remembers, what you were doing here in such an honorable and dignified way, you are showing the gratitude of a country, everybody in that country, for the peace, the stability we live in, for the sacrifice of our people. And you can have your own reasons, but as a military officer, I have my own. We walk in the backs of former soldiers, dead, alive, and injured. We've learned the lessons of their struggles. We're better equipped and better for it when we have to face the conflict of tomorrow. Now, that is the 7th book of remembrance. That is where the 158 names of Canadian Forces members killed in Afghanistan are inscribed. But that is the story that everybody has heard for the last 6 years, since 2006, when the Canadian Forces went to Kandahar. Also in that book are 1,700 other names of Canadian Forces men and women who've died since 1947. And I wear a Navy uniform, and there's 100 Navy sailors in there that died in the fire in the Kootenay, the aviation gas tanks of the Bonaventure, or in the fire in the Nipigon, or the collision in the Micmac, the death on the Chicoutimi. They're all in there. There's 100 of them. And that's where you'll find the service of sailors recorded for our great country. And that's all I really had to say. There's the face of the sentinel on the Peace Tower. And one other final little thing. That's my grandfather, who came home from the Great War, injured. The first plastic surgery, that was the gift of the First World War, was the plastic surgery done in England to repair the disfigured faces of the shrapnel and bullet wounds. And that's, if there's any miracles that come out of conflict, and there's always many, one of them was the great techniques of surgery and medical healing, including plastic surgery that is so important to us today. So I hope it wasn't too heavy of a message. It's a remembrance message. There's a real reason we're doing this. There's a real reason we wear our poppies. And boy, it sure makes a sailor and a soldier and all my fellow Canadian Forces members so proud when they see community members getting it, like you have. And thank you, Ken. Thank you, Don, for inviting me. You're a Canadian Forces Liaison Council member whose job it is to make the the life of the Canadian Forces Reserve member a better life by working it out with his employer, because there's no legislation in Canada to look after that relationship. Thank you for your service. And thank you all for inviting me in the wonderful lunch and the time here amongst you. Now I know you want to say something, but Don said if there was any time left, and there's 1 minute left till 20 after, so if there was a question from anybody, that's where I'd really like to talk. If anybody had a question, I would take it. You, Don.
Well, I just like you to share. We had some waves that were on the lakes to the Sandy episode around here, 24 to 28 feet. Have you been in any seas that maybe were a little higher that you shared with me last night?
Okay, so he took me out for a drink last night, and so you know. Okay, so the North Atlantic Ocean is the roughest ocean in the world. It's called the North Atlantic. It's called the Wintertime North Atlantic. It's written on the plimsoll line of freighters, so they load freighters differently in the wintertime, and there's a line on the side of the ship, load to here or you'll sink. And the same seas that sank the Ocean Ranger back in the 80s were about the biggest I've been in. They're 90 feet high. Those aren't the biggest, but that was the biggest I was in. I just wanted the anecdote about heavy seas in a ship is sailors don't face the same dangers as soldiers for the most part. It's a steel box, it's comfortable inside for the most part. You don't see the face-to-face with your enemy, he's a long distance away. But one thing a soldier and a sailor share is that once you're in it, whether it's conflict or at the front or in a ship or in a storm, you're stuck there. You have nobody else to turn to but your shipmates and the equipment you've been given by the Crown, and you trust in that. And that's the emotion we share with our brethren. You're there, you can't get out of it, you can't go home. And you just wonder, how did I get here? And so, in the 90-foot seas, that was my memory. Yes, way in the back there, sir.
Thank you. It's very, very interesting. One of the things that we need to be concerned about are the benefits that these soldiers need to receive after coming home. And as chair of the CART, which is an association that we are working for, that is the benefits, either the pension benefits or the other benefits, medical benefits to the survivors who are coming in here, the veterans who are coming in here, and their families are not really to the extent that they should be. So it is not the job, I think, of the military, but it is the job of the public like us to make sure that the soldiers and their families after the war are actually being served well in this country.
Thank you, because that's so right. I don't think anybody in the Canadian Forces would ask for anything different than what the Workmen's Compensation Act provides to a laborer injured on the job. And when the new Veterans Charter was announced in 2006, well, first off, is there any press here? Okay, Chatham House rules, right? When the new Veterans Charter was announced in 2006, the Legion and the Canadian Forces applauded it. The new Veterans Charter purports to move money and benefits faster to the Canadian Forces injured member or the deceased spouse, mainly to the member. And that was the premise of the new Veterans Charter. New veterans being the casualties of the conflict in Afghanistan, and new society, new social pressures, needed a better system to get those veterans through their claim process, which is split between the Canadian Forces and the Veterans Affairs Canada, and get the money into their hands. And the new Veterans Charter has as its heart a lump sum payment. If that system of the new Veterans Charter is actually more complicated, and because of errors in its design, if, then something's wrong. If our members get far less than the workmen's compensation is giving to injured workers, I think there was something that was not intended by the government, and it's for the veterans and their lawyers and Veterans Affairs Canada and the senior personnel leaders of the Canadian Forces to go to work and try to fix it. I don't think it's in the government's interest or intent, not in their intent, to cause any kind of hardship financially for an injured veteran. And I'll leave it at that. It's a very charged question. There's a lot of negative news on it. But we have, aside from the new Veterans Charter, and we have, for a very strong partner, Veterans Affairs Canada. They are a partner federal department. We are so well coordinated between the two departments now. Doesn't mean there's not problems. And we have a lot of other things like the integrated personal supports centers and the joint personal support units, and a lot of benefits while members are in the Canadian Forces and still transitioning to civilian life because of their injuries. We have great linkages with community and social care systems, and these things didn't exist before. So there's 90% good, and there's something we're working on the as you're trying to bring to the floor here. There's piece we have to work on. So thank you for a great question.
After my thank you, we will have a laying of the wreath. Commodore John, thank you for your incredible talk, reminding us in a powerful and poignant way of the true costs of war, the pain that war brings, but more importantly, reminding us of the need for peace and peace studies. In your name, we are making a donation to Rotary International to enhance its programs in peace and conflict resolution. We also believe as Rotarians that the cornerstone of peace begins with human interactions, and that humans should interact in the way dictated by our four-way test. So we give you this plaque to remind you of our commitment to good relationship, peaceful relationships, and the importance of peace. Thank you very much.